Anyway, you guys had asked me for a really great guest. And someone said to me, "Boy, you better have a really good guest on Tuesday's podcast to talk about all this stuff." And I was like, huh, all right. So, who better than Hans von Spakovsky, who is a senior legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation, and he's a former FEC commissioner, so important right now, and a DOJ lawyer. So, let's try this again. Hans, welcome to Mary Walter Radio. Thank you for joining me.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. And Hans actually is really doing us a favor because he's gallivanting at some conference or something. And I've seen Hans gallivant. He's quite the gallivanter. And he has taken the time to go back to his hotel room to do the podcast with us. So we, again, really appreciate that. So I'm going to try to get you out early. We already have, I'm sure all these comments are, can't hear you, can't hear you, can't hear you, ha, ha, ha. Let's see. Who do we have here? I hope your guest has all the answers. I'm really looking forward to tonight's podcast. Yes, Dan says Hans was an FEC commission. Okay. Does a POTUS candidate need two citizen parents before they're born to to be Article 2 eligible? As per Hassan versus FEC DC Circuit, 14th and 5th Amendments don't overrule natural born requirements. Well, we can start right off with that, Hans, if you'd like to.
I'm sorry, is the question, do you have to have two parents who are natural born citizens?
Does a POTUS presidential candidate need two citizen parents before they're born to be Article 2 eligible? And then he goes on to say, as per Hassan versus the FEC DC Circuit, 14th and 5th Amendments don't overrule natural born requirement.
Well, that's an interesting question. I actually believe that the 14th Amendment has been misinterpreted to say that if you are born in the United States, you are a U.S. citizen. I actually don't think that's correct. I think if one of your parents is a U.S. citizen at the time you are born, yes, you are a United States citizen, whether you're born in the United States or anywhere else in the world. But if both of your parents are not U.S. citizens at the time you are born, and your parents are in this country illegally, I don't think that makes you a U.S. citizen, but that's not the way it's been interpreted now for many decades by the U.S. government and the State Department. I actually think that's something that could eventually get challenged. The Supreme Court hasn't really ruled on that issue. There are some very old cases having to do with permanent resident aliens and their children, but not for people, for example, who are here illegally. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but
I think it does. Yeah, I think that does answer it. Her parents were born, her father was born in Jamaica, her mother was born in India, but the birth certificate does not make any mention of their citizenship status at the time that she was born in Oakland, California. They just say her White House bio states that her parents were immigrants from Jamaica and India. Now, from what I understand, also the 14th Amendment, it wasn't really until the 1960s that they started to interpret it as liberally as they do now. Prior to the 1960s,
correct.
it was interpreted as no, you have to be in the country legally when you have, when you have a baby
Right.
here, and then that baby is born here is a citizen. So, all right. So I got to find out if her parents were in the country legally. So I don't have that. So there we go. Boy, they started right off the bat with you, Hans. See, I promoted that you were going to be on, and EB made this beautiful graphic for you. And now I have one for you for just any time you come on. And I got, they're ready with the questions. Let's see. Unmute, mic check, don't have sound. Yeah. Let's see. Okay. So as Scott says, great, an election knowledgeable person. I've been hearing multiple things about it. Birthright citizenship needs to be redefined. Yes, 1960 and 61 for Kamala's parents emigrating here. She's born in 64. No 5 years residency for Kamala's parents. So, but to your point, it's being the 14th Amendment has been very liberally interpreted. So it doesn't really matter. She's going to be running for president of the United States. So I have a lot of questions regarding this, as I think a lot of people do. First of all, can her name get on the ballot in every state? Is there enough time? I know Ohio is the outlier. Ohio was a problem, but Ohio and I believe it was Louisiana bent over backwards to change their laws there for getting on the ballot just to accommodate the Democrats and their late nominating convention. So, are there any problems with getting her on any
You
ballots?
know that look, the dates are different in the 50 states. A lot of states have mid-August deadlines for a political party to certify to state election officials who their presidential nominee is, so that that person's name can be put on the ballot. Some states have early September. Virginia, for example, where I'm actually a resident, September 6th is the deadline. So I think the deadlines are very short for the Democratic Party, but I think they probably will be able to meet the deadlines in most of the states. And I suspect that if the nomination occurs late in, one to a handful of states, I think they will probably go to those states and ask them to extend the deadline either through the legislature or however the process is. And frankly, I doubt that a lot of states are going to say no to that.
I gotta tell you though, if Trump was the one who was going to be missing the deadline, I'm pretty sure a lot of states would not be accommodating that.
Well, that's true given the history of how they tried to have him not be on the ballot at all in the case that went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Fortunately, all 9 justices said the states couldn't do that.
Right, right. Yeah, that was and the Demo that was when the Democrats hated the Supreme Court. Sometimes they love it and sometimes they hate it, but I guess that's pretty much both sides when it comes to that. So, okay, the process that the Democrats have put in place,
Right.
Kamala Harris is going to be running for president, and she has never received one vote in a primary election for president. Because in 2020, she flamed out, the money ran out, she flamed out before the Iowa caucuses because she was so bad. She
Right.
hasn't received one vote as a presidential candidate. Is that up to them to decide how they choose their nominee, or is there a process involved? It just seems very undemocratic to me.
Well, look, generally, most states have rules. The DNC had rules saying that um, that you, as a delegate, when you're elected in the, if Biden won the primary in your state, then if you're a delegate from that state to the national convention, you're pledged to vote for Joe Biden. But I think most folks would pretty much agree. Well, the pledge disappears if that candidate is no longer in the race, and that I
Right.
think throws it open at the convention for the convention delegates to decide who their nominee should be. There's about 4,000 delegates from the states, most of whom were pledged to vote for Biden. The Democratic Party also has a huge number of what they call super delegates. These
Yeah.
are the 739 super delegates who were not pledged, and they didn't get their position by the primary election. They simply got their position because of who they are and the political post that they hold. So, in essence, I think you pretty much have an open convention in which the delegates get to vote and decide who their nominee is. Look, that's very old fashioned. As you know, before primaries became such a big deal in the US, we had open conventions, and it was at the conventions that parties nominated their presidential candidates.
And that's not even going to happen because the Democrats have a pretty much mostly remote, there's a fly in here, a remote convention this year for two reasons. Number one, they didn't want an open convention. They didn't want anyone challenging Joe. That was
Right.
the first thing. But also, with the anti-Semite part of their wing, the little Hitler Youth, coming out and threatening to protest. They didn't want, scenes of 1968 because it's in Chicago again. So they didn't
Right.
want a replay of that either. They didn't want those visuals. So now they've put themselves in a position of not having an open convention, which I think is something they want again. They don't want anyone challenging Kamala, right? Like they don't want that to happen, although they seem so enthusiastic. They've all fallen in line quite quickly with
Well,
all of this.
they have, although look, they are saying they're going to have a virtual vote. And for the virtual vote, obviously, I think they're going to have to allow all the individuals who are delegates to be able to vote in that virtual vote. But obviously, there won't be anybody who's going to be able to protest that if it's being done virtually before they show up at the convention.
Right, right. It's such as to me, it's such a farce, and they're the ones who run around talking about preserving democracy, and
Right.
they've just had the most undemocratic. They literally had, in my humble opinion, a coup and an installation. They threw Biden out. Come on, you know that there's been some deal cut, and Hans and I used to host together on radio, so I know he has opinions. And these are not in his official capacity, obviously, but in my humble opinion, Hunter's getting pardoned. Joe's brother Jim's getting pardoned. His brother Frank's getting pardoned. They're all going to get pardoned. I'm sure there's a sweet golden parachute that they're getting, just like the director of the Secret Service. I'm sure she got a sweet deal too. There's been some very sweet deal cut in order to get Jill Biden to, let go of the banister in the White House because she doesn't want to leave. So it's just like the most they're on the Democrat side, they're selected, not elected. And the rank and file seem to sense no irony whatsoever in screaming about preserving democracy while they literally threw the old guy out and installed the choice of the party elites, not the people.
Well, look, it is very odd. Just within days still of a letter coming out from Joe Biden saying he was withdrawing, he was getting angry when he was being asked about that in public. He was angry. He was adamant that he would not get out, and then all of a sudden he gets out. I mean, obviously, right now we don't know what actually happened behind the scenes. We do know that there are reports that senior Democratic officials were all traveling to Delaware to speak to him. I'm sure at some point memoirs are going to come out, and we'll finally find out what exactly was said and whether any threats were made, telling him, if you don't drop out by yourself, we're going to force you out. But we won't know about that for a while unless we get a leaker.
Well, that official letter from Joe Biden resigning the presidency, first of all, the announcement was made on social media. I don't know, not super presidential in my book. You would think there'd be like a press conference or, the fake White House backdrop that they have everywhere he goes, and he'd be sitting in front of the camera, making an official statement. We didn't get that. And the letter wasn't even on White House letterhead.
Well, there was a reason for that, Mary, which is that,
what was it?
Look, this was a campaign statement, which is why it was not on presidential letterhead. You wouldn't want to use presidential letterhead because this is not an official act of a president. This was an act of a candidate.
I think I could argue the other side of that because he is resigning. He is resigning the presidency as the president, which seems pretty presidential, which seems like he would use the presidential,
Well,
stationary.
look, if he was resigning as president, that would be on official letterhead. But to me, an announcement that he's not going to run as a candidate, that I don't think should come on official government letterhead.
All right. Well, you're the expert, which is why you're here. Let's see. Okay, I got lots of questions here for you. Hermit Sal wants to know, is it legal for Democrats not to have another primary? No primary means that the people don't choose. That's kind of what we have been discussing now. And along those lines, Now Tax USA wants to know, can the voters demand a new primary?
No, it's going to depend on state law, and state laws probably don't allow for that. Most states have rules in place, and the parties have rules in place. I mean, to give you another example, um, if a party nominates a candidate, and this is in the DNC rules, and this is accommodated by the states. If someone is elected in a primary election and then they withdraw, they die, whatever reason, that position becomes vacant. Um, the states all say, well, there's not really time for another primary election before the general election. So all the rules say that the political party, in this case for a national candidate, the Democratic National Committee would get to choose who replaces who's put in place of the vacant position. Here, this has
Okay.
happened just before the convention. So it's still up to the
Right.
delegates to vote at the convention to decide who the nominee should be. But if Biden had been elected as the nominee and then he had resigned a day later, it wouldn't have been the delegates choosing, it would have been the DNC choosing who the new nominee should be.
Which I don't know. I think it's still the DNC choosing who the nominee is going to be, and the delegates are being told get in line. This is the deal, and they all dutifully do, and we're all going to pretend that this is legitimate. If Joe, well, is there enough time for them to reprint the absentee ballots that already have Joe Biden's name on it with his name checked off?
Well, that's what the state deadlines are for. Like I said at the
You missed
beginning,
the joke, Hans. You
the
totally missed the joke.
the deadlines in most of the states are in August. That's about half the states. Others have early September. That's the deadline for the party to get the name to state officials so that they can print it on both absentee ballots and get it ready for early voting in states like Virginia, which now has 45 days of early voting before the election.
North Carolina starts North Carolina starts early. North Carolina is one of the first September 2nd they start. September 6th. September 6th. They're the first ones to go out.
Yeah, so I'm sure that I don't have the chart. I have a chart that's got the deadlines in all the states. I don't have that in front of me, but I suspect they're one of the states with an August deadline for getting the name to the states.
Yeah. Yeah, theirs go out super early. North Carolina is like one of the first ones to send theirs out. They will start sending absentee ballots to voters who have registered them on September 6th, the earliest in the country, according to Patrick Gannon, the public information director for the North Carolina State Board of Elections. Let's see. Gregory says, I bet they rewrite the rules to make everyone a super delegate.
Look, it is true. Remember, before a convention starts, this is both Republican Democratic parties, there is a meeting of the Rules Committee. And it's the Rules Committee that sets up the final rules for the holding of a convention. So, any kind of rule that's standing in their way for what they want to do, they could potentially change right before the convention starts.
Well, listen, I get, why the RNC and the DNC, and I'm sure the RNC's rules are much more strict than the DNC's rules. They're probably a little bit more fluffy, a little more loosey goosey. But they get to make their own rules, and that's the way it goes. And they're going to make rules that are going to benefit them and their candidates. It makes a lot of sense.
Right.
Okay, so now Tax USA says, if is the convention based on the primary, why even have a primary? Right? If your convention's not based on the primary, why even have a primary? If you can go to the convention and vote whatever you want. I mean, they're supposed to vote, the pledge delegates are supposed to vote the way for the primary, whoever wins the primary. But when you have 700 super delegates who could do whatever they want, then what's the point of the primary?
Well, look, we didn't have, if you go back to the 1940s, 1950s, before then, we didn't have primary elections. We just had state conventions where they elected the delegates that would go to their national convention, and it was the national convention where they would choose their presidential nominee. That's the way Abraham Lincoln, for example, got nominated. Starting in the 60s, a lot of people said, "Oh, that's undemocratic." The deals are made, backroom deals are made in smoke-filled rooms, and we should switch to a primary system. Yes, the primary system will still send the delegates who represent the candidate who won to the national convention, and there they will be pledged to vote for whoever won the primary in their state on the first vote. So if you got to a convention and someone didn't win enough primaries to actually, have the majority, then after that first vote, it would be thrown up into the air. And even for primary states, people would then be able to vote for different candidates. But we haven't had an open convention like that since, I think, the early 1970s.
I think, wasn't it JFK Jr.? Wasn't it all the backroom dealing that was done in, what was that, 1960? Wasn't that this primary at the GNC convention? Because his dad was going around and paying the delegates that the system changed. Wasn't that one of the impetus, the impetus to change it to the primary system as opposed to just these backroom deals, because he was
Yeah.
going around paying the delegates?
Well, that very well may be, but that's why we have primary elections today. And like I said, generally at conventions, they're not open anymore. The primaries determine, even the political party conventions have been more for show, to put on a big television production, than a real convention where there's real dealing for someone to be nominated.
Gotcha. All right. Dan Byer said, my dad was a New York UG McCarthy delegate in 1968.
Wow.
Great party. Wow. Okay. Now Tax USA wants to know, is the Democrat Party committing election fraud? That's a pretty broad question.
Well, I'm not sure what they're asking.
I guess anywhere in general, anywhere along the line, does anything smell to you, having been a former FEC commissioner?
Well, look, there's all kinds of things. You and I could talk for a couple of hours about election fraud, when and how it occurs in the country. I mean, I don't think there's anything right now going on with the DNC and what's happened with Biden dropping out and Kamala Harris trying to become the nominee. I don't think that's the issue so much as, what kind of pressure is being put on the actual delegates, the 4,000 delegates from the states to the convention, to just vote her in. Is there any consideration for any other candidate? And I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, my hunch is there is not a consideration for any other candidate, considering they wouldn't really let anybody else run. They wouldn't have a debate. There were no debates with other candidates. There were no debates with Marianne Williamson or it's the other guy who was running. I had never heard of him before. They wouldn't let RFK Jr. anywhere near them, so he had to leave and go run as an independent. So they pretty much took any kind of democracy out of the entire process. Let's see. Suze Loves Jeffy says, seems to me that this is voter suppression by the Dems. No one voted for her for president. Who was the real threat to democracy? It's exactly what we've been talking about. Porchview Farm, they made Sicilian flu Joe an offer he couldn't refuse. Yeah, the whole COVID thing. Can I just say, maybe he had COVID. I ain't buying it. I said from the very beginning, I'm like, something's not right here. Suddenly Joe has COVID, but he gets out of a car and he didn't have a mask on, and nobody in the car had a mask on, and they're big on the masking, right? Joe has no mask on. Yeah, and that's COVID. Since when are we not wearing masks now when you're around people who have COVID? If everybody masks up right away, right? Especially the left. So
well, the other, Mary, the
know.
other odd thing about that was, the White House has a complete medical facility. His Delaware home does not. You would think that if the president has come down with COVID, he would want to be at the White House, where there is a medical facilities, doctors, everything needed to treat him, particularly if he suffers any kind of the severe secondary symptoms that people sometimes get with COVID, and yet he goes to Delaware to spend his time there. Of course, realize the other big difference between the Delaware and the White House is there are no visitor logs in Delaware.
Exactly.
So,
Exactly.
the Secret Service would not have to reveal in a Freedom of Information Act request, well, who visited him in Delaware while he was there supposedly with COVID. So it's just kind of an interesting contrast between his home and the White House.
Well, to Dan's point here, did Hillary have a walk and talk with Joe? Sue says she thinks Pennsylvania is the first for mail-ins. I don't know when Pennsylvania is. Dan, would a change in state ballots be able to be by a court or need a state legislator be the only vehicle? I'm sorry, Dan, but if you voiced to texted that really made no sense. I think he wants to know is a change in state ballots, does that have to go to a court or state legislature to make any changes for like deadlines and things like that? I think it has to go through the state legislature, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, if there's a deadline set in state law, then if you wanted to change that, you would want to have the governor call a special session in to change the deadline. If folks recall, that just happened a little while ago in Ohio. In Ohio, the legislature had already gone out, and the governor called a special session up just so they could change the Ohio deadline because of the late date of the Democratic National Convention.
So what about all those state laws that were changed randomly by election commissioners, state election commissioners during COVID to extend deadlines for accepting ballots, to get rid of voter right verification, all the changes that they made, some
Right.
of them in Pennsylvania, one of them was made the night before. Like as they're kind of they changed it the night before, and some counties made the change and other counties didn't make the change. What about all those rules? And some of them are still standing today, despite them not going through state legislatures.
Well, a lot of those officials were claiming that they had the right to do that under under certain statutes that granted them, they claimed, the ability to do that under when an emergency hits the state. And they were, as you know, claiming that the pandemic and all the problems it was causing gave them the power to do that. I think that was, frankly, very doubtful, but I think they would have a much more difficult time claiming that this is some kind of emergency that allows them to override state statutes. I think if there's a problem, the DNC is going to have to convince either the governor to call the state legislature back into session to change a deadline so that they can get the new nominee's name on the ballot. Or if that doesn't work, they can try to sue and make some kind of claim, perhaps under the state constitution. But I don't think they can just. I don't think election officials can just waive the deadline legally anyway. But as we know, sometimes officials they don't follow the law.
Yes. Now, this piece that I'm looking at here says that the Heritage Foundation has promised to sue if Biden drops out. Marguerite Bowling, the senior communications manager, said this. This is from the Center Square, which is a news outlet. Sent them an email saying that the team is holding off on any media requests for now. She said more is coming from the Heritage Foundation's oversight project. Let's see, the oversight project, in a statement on social media following Biden's announcement, said, "We have been preparing for this moment for months. Many in the media tried discrediting us. Who's laughing now? No more make it up as you go elections. Stay tuned." I know you don't speak for them, and I know that you're not part of the oversight project at Heritage, but what could they possibly be suing for if Joe Biden drops out?
Well, I can't answer that because I'm not part of the oversight project, so I don't really have any insight into that. So I can't really answer.
Well, I thought maybe I asked because I thought maybe you heard some scuttlebutt in the bathroom. You never know, right?
No, I haven't. I haven't.
You're so tight-lipped sometimes. Let's see. Now Tax USA says they say the life and times of Jill and Joe Biden will be available for Christmas, destined to be a #1 bestseller. Uh, okay, let's go on to now. Scott asks a good question here. Let's talk about we talked about the delegates pledged to Kamala Harris. All 50 state Democrat Party chairs have endorsed Harris. And we've got all this money that's coming in. Biden officially transferred his entire campaign apparatus and the 96 million that it had in the bank to Kamala Harris. So let's talk about that, because Sean Cooksey, who is the chair of the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, he's been making the rounds. He was on NPR. He was on with Laura Ingraham. And I watched it with Laura Ingraham, and he said, in his view, that the money should not be transferable to Harris because it was for the Joe Biden campaign, or the Joe Biden. It just had Joe Biden's name on it. It was not for the Biden-Harris campaign. So can Biden for president, and they changed the paperwork to Harris for president within hours of the president's decision. My bank isn't open on Sundays. Apparently theirs is. But they just changed it from Biden to president to Harris for president. And he's saying there's a problem with that because her name, the funds weren't raised in her name. Where do you think this goes?
Look, I know, Sean, I don't want to disagree with
just
him
say
or
it.
question him, but the FEC is run by 6 commissioners. Okay. And it takes the votes of 4 agreeing on a particular issue when it comes to what the law says. I actually looked at the registration statement that was filed by the Biden for President campaign committee. Okay, when you form a political campaign committee, you have to file a registration form with the FEC. It lists what your name is, where you're headquartered, who your treasurer is. And it specifically, in the form I saw, said that this committee was being registered for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris.
Okay.
So look, if I was one of the 6 commissioners, I used to be one. Thank goodness I'm not one now. I mean, I actually would think that the law allowed this to happen because her name was on that registration form. I believe she actually also has control of the money. In the long run, it doesn't really matter, because let's assume for just a second that the FEC said, oh, you can't do that. The money can't be transferred to Kamala Harris's control. Under federal law, and this is absolutely clear cut, there's no question of this, a campaign committee can contribute all of its money to a political party. So even if the FEC were to say, oh, nope, you can't do this, and it would take 4 votes to do it, well, then the Biden for President committee could simply give all of its money to the Democratic National Committee. And the Democratic National Committee could then use it to support its ticket.
See, now last night on Laura Ingram's show, he was saying that they would have to return it, or at least offer to return it to the people who donated it, because they may not want to donate to Kamala for president. They were really donating to Joe for president, not Kamala, and that they would have to offer to give it back.
Provision in federal law that requires a refund.
Okay.
So I'm not quite sure where he's getting that. If someone runs for office and, for example, they don't win, it's pretty clear that under the law, they don't have to return the money. They can give it all to their political party. So I think the Biden for President committee could give it all to the DNC if they wanted to.
Wow. I got to figure out how to get on that gravy train. A lot of money flying around and none of it's coming my way. Where do I get on that?
Way, if it's really true that only Biden can control the money, the other thing he could do is say, you know what? I'm giving all of this money out in charitable contributions.
Yeah. to his granddaughter, to his sister, to his brother, to Hunter. By the way, aren't you, who's the sucker now if you paid thousands of dollars for one of those Hunter Biden paintings? Right?
Right.
I think that thing just plummeted in value. All right. I know you want to get back to what you're doing, so let me hurry here. By the way, you live in Virginia, and you're not in Virginia right now.
I'm not, but I live in Virginia and I
Right.
registered.
Okay. No. I thought you were at a conference in Virginia, and I'm like, then why are you in a hotel room?
Yes.
Okay. Dan says, someone on Twitter said, so it must be true. The Code of Federal Rules and Regulations require the donations to Joe to be refunded to the donors. Okay, so that's what we were just asking. So you said that's not true. He says 14 CFR, which is the Code of Federal Rules and Regulations, 110.1, referencing campaign contributions and the DNC, cannot transfer the money from Joe Biden to Kamala. The candidate must have already passed the DNC convention and then drop out to pass the money on.
Well, like I said, I just don't think that's true because of the fact that the campaign committee was registered for both candidates.
Okay.
If
So there
it
you
was,
go.
look, if the committee said this is Joe Biden's committee only, then that would be correct. But like I said, if you look at the registration statement they filed, the registration statement was for
Okay.
both candidates. And I think that's the difference here.
He says, okay. All right. So Joe Biden dropping out before. So he's dropping out for health reasons or whatever reason they're going to make up, right? Can he, if he is unfit to be reelected health wise, can he still serve until January 20th? How does that work?
Well, if you look at his letter, he doesn't say he's unfit to serve. He just says that, you know, it would be good for the country for him to get out, blah, blah, blah. He doesn't say anything about him being unfit to serve.
So he's just
The only
go ahead.
way he could be removed from serving if he's not willing to take himself out as president under the 25th Amendment is if the vice president and 2/3 of his cabinet secretaries write a letter, sign a letter to Congress saying the president is unable to carry out his duties as president. And you and I both know, and I think all your viewers know, that there's no way that Kamala Harris and 2/3 of the cabinet secretaries are going to do that. I mean, that just isn't going to happen.
I don't know. I think she's a little power hungry. Wouldn't surprise me if she gets a head start on being president. You know what I mean? Wouldn't surprise me. So he basically just said, I'm not feeling it.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm dropping out. I'm just not feeling it. I don't know. This whole thing stinks to high heaven. Now, here's something else. I think they may be trying to push him out as to with a health reason because the DOJ told a federal judge yesterday that they have suddenly found transcripts that they previously denied having of President Joe Biden's talks with that biographer, in which they have a discussion about secret documents that were classified documents. And now suddenly the DOJ, after denying being in possession of these transcripts, suddenly found the transcripts. Huh, imagine that. So to me, this whole thing smells. I think that they're going to try to push him out early. If they're suddenly finding things that they stonewalled about, we don't have it. I don't know where it is. Because the alphabet agencies protect the Democrats right, left, and sideways. All of a sudden, the alphabet agencies are turning on Joe Biden now. That doesn't sound like they expect him to go to January.
Well, I don't know. I mean, that just shows one of the multiple problems with the U.S. Department of Justice. In that particular case, yeah, their lawyer in court told the judge that they didn't have a transcript and then had to go back and say, oops, sorry, I was mistaken. We do have written transcripts, which shows either incompetence by justice or them misleading the court intentionally and suddenly deciding to change what they were doing. I don't know which it is, but I will tell you, one of the biggest tasks that a new president faces in January is reforming and cleaning out the Department of Justice.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I saw some guy on Twitter who said he used to work for the Secret Service or the whatever, one of the alphabets. And he said, I hereby volunteer. You don't even have to pay me. But on President Trump's first day in office, I am more than happy to go down the hall and go, fire that one, fire that one. That one's okay.
Yeah.
Get rid of this or get rid of that one. Yeah. Because they know who needs to go. Dan says Joe made it up the big stairs to Air Force One today. Hey, so maybe he's ready to keep going. Hermit Sal says, I hear that anyone who
Well, like I
mispronounces
said,
Go ahead.
yeah, I just don't think voluntarily he is going to leave the presidency. Look, people need to remember, and I was reminded of this the other day. There's a TV channel that runs old TV shows, and every night they run the Johnny Carson show. And I was watching an episode from 1988, and when he came out to do his monologue, he was making jokes about this senator from Delaware who was in his first run for president, Joe Biden, 1988. Yes. He does not want to give up being president after seeking it for 4 decades.
Yeah, I wonder what happens if he refuses to leave. I know they said that's what Trump's going to do. He's going to be a dictator. He's never going to leave office. Wouldn't it be interesting to see? And I think it's more Jill than it is Joe. And honestly, I don't know if they've told Joe that he's resigned yet. Like, I don't know if they've told him that. I would not be surprised if he doesn't even know. Like, and boy, is he going to be mad when he finds out. Oof. I wouldn't want to be around Grandpa when he finds out that he's not going to be president again. Or they're just going to tell him that he won, and they're just going to keep up the charade until he dies. It's what's going to happen. All right, Dan. Let's see. Dan says the tapes are the key, not the transcripts. Admissible evidence, admissions against interest. Transcripts are not beats evidence. Transcripts are not beats evidence. For the love of God, Dan, could you learn how to type? FRCP 1002, he stole classified docs. Tapes are key for a cross. Yeah, but he's never going to stand trial for it. It was all show. We all know that. He said it's the best evidence rule.
By the way, Mary, on that issue, keep in mind that the presidential immunity rule that just was handed down by the Supreme Court would not apply to Joe Biden if the Justice Department actually wanted to go ahead with prosecuting him for mishandling those classified documents. Why? Because when he basically stole those classified documents, he was a U.S. senator.
Yes.
He was not
MVP. Yeah. Right. Senator and VP. Right.
Yes.
Oh, wouldn't that be amazing? Listen, those tapes are long gone. Those audio recordings of her interview, that went the way of the January 6th interviews and those videotapes and everything else, and Hillary's emails and her BlackBerry and all of the Secret Service texts and messages on January 6th. They all disappeared. It's amazing how much evidence Democrats seem to lose. It's absolutely amazing. And they keep doing it because they're never punished for it. So as long as you're allowed to continue to do it, then you're going to continue to do it.
Right.
Yeah. Let's see. Steve says, I'm not listening to your responses. Huh. Hans, do you feel not listened to?
That's his loss.
So Scott has one last question here, and then we're going to go because I know you're busy, and I appreciate all your time. But Scott says, so could a person use their popularity to get a lot of money donated, and having filed the papers and everything, and then just give it to somebody else and not run?
There are limits. I mean, for example, if you're running for office and you've raised campaign funds and you want to give funds to another candidate, you can't give them more than $2,000. So the Biden for President committee if, for example, it wanted to give money to, let's say, Chuck Schumer or some other Democrat running, no, they can't transfer $92 million to Chuck Schumer. All they can give him is $2,000.
Right. But because Kamala's name was on that filing, all of that money can go to her because it's presumed that it's hers. But if her name was not on that filing, then they couldn't transfer it.
That's exactly right.
Okay. So it's like having a joint account.
Yes, I believe
Basically.
so. Now, look, keep in mind, this is an unprecedented issue, because in the entire time that we've had the Federal Election Campaign Act, and that's the law that governs all this issue has never come up. So if this got before the FEC and it had to decide whether or not this was legal and whether or not it broke the law, like I said, it would take a vote of the 6 commissioners. They would get to decide on the legality of this, and it would take 4 votes out of 6 to come to a conclusive opinion on that.
So is this the first time that a president has dropped out this close to the because to the nominating convention? But I don't think it is. Who else dropped out in the 60s, or is it the 50s? Wasn't Eisenhower? It was Lyndon Johnson, right?
Yeah, Lyndon Johnson, but he dropped out for 68. Now, the other more recent example of something like this happened, but it happened after the convention, was, folks may recall, when George McGovern became the Democratic nominee, his vice presidential candidate was Tom Eagleton. And if you recall, a big story hit after he became the vice presidential nominee, that he had been previously treated for, I think, mental illness. I think he'd had a nervous breakdown, something like that. And he dropped out of the race. And
Eagleton did.
Eagleton did. And McGovern
Okay.
had to pick a new vice presidential candidate to be the vice presidential nominee.
Okay. One last question here. Dan wants to know, clearly Dan's a lawyer. He wants to know, assuming the FEC made a decision and the citizen did not like it, would a citizen have standing to challenge in federal court?
The way that something like this would be initiated is anyone can file a complaint with the FEC. They wouldn't go to the federal court, because the federal court would say, you need to first go to the Federal Election Commission. And the way the Federal Election Commission works and what the law says is anyone can file a complaint with the FEC. All they have to do is send a written notification that's been notarized. And the FEC then decides whether or not there is sufficient reason to believe that the law has been potentially violated to open up an investigation. If the commissioners say, no, we don't think there's sufficient reason to believe that the law has been violated, then they don't open up an investigation. But again, it takes 4 votes out of the 6 commissioners to decide whether to open up an investigation or not.
Okay. Wow, so interesting. I'm going to let you get back to your cavorting at your conference and your gallivanting. Thank you for your time, Hans.
Okay, yeah. I'm going to go be cavorting, right?
You're going to cavort or gallivant, whichever one you feel like doing. But thank you for your time. I mean,
Sure.
I had so many questions. Obviously, the viewers had questions, and I really, really appreciate it. You are just a font of information, and I really like you. You're a very nice guy. So appreciate it, Hans. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Mary. Bye-bye.
All right, bye-bye. All right, please subscribe to the channel if you have not done so. Please like the podcast, especially if you go back and view them. If you view old ones, please like them. The audio will be available on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Probably tomorrow, maybe not tonight. We'll see. I'll try to get it done tonight, so I'll do my best to get it done. Just look for Mary Walter Radio on all of those platforms. Let's see. Next week, I will be on for Wendy Bell on Wendy Bell Radio Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. That's 9 a.m. to noon. You can see it live on Rumble, on the Wendy Bell Radio app. Also on it's on X. It's live on X. I don't think it's on, and maybe on YouTube as well. But I'll post everything on my X account. Follow me, Mary Walter Radio, and of course this is on Gitter as well at Mary Walter Radio. And then so that's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Thursday and Friday, I will be on WPHT out of Philadelphia on the morning show, 6 to 10 a.m. Oofa. And it's video too. So like I have to get up and I have to look halfway decent, which is super, super annoying. So let's see very quickly. Now Text USA says, thanks, Hans. Dan says, thank you. This was awesome. Porch Farm, this has been wonderful. Thank you guys for all of the great questions. You guys are fantastic. Watching your back, great conversation. I love Hans. I think he's wonderful. And like I said, we've had many opportunities to co-host together when I was in Washington, D.C. And I just love the way Hans can take things down to like our level. He doesn't get stuck in all of this lawyer speak. And I really appreciate that about him. Hermit Sal says, interesting program. Thank you. Gregory says, goodbye, everybody. Squeaky Ron wants to know, what about Secret Service Director Cheeto and who shot JR? I was not going to get involved in that when we had Hans on tonight, but thank you. So I will see everybody again next week. We'll be right here again on Tuesday. We'll see what happens this week before I know who my guest is on Tuesday. Have a great week, everybody. Have a good one. Bye-bye.